you are gonna see some cool ass shit.
Yeah, you don't want two Flavor Flays.
Heart transplants, brain surgeries. I've seen it all.
Dude, that's fucking dope.
Walk up and just get it, whatever it is.
Yeah, brother.
I'm trying not to laugh, bro, but Josh is fucking killing me.
Guess what Navy SEALs do, motherfucker? They communicate and they're on the same fucking page.
Whoa. To try it.
We're live.
Welcome everybody to the Happy Hoodlums podcast and a happy 420 to you. We have a very special guest tonight. So you already know the host by now, or you should. We got Zach Sampson, the powerful meat fortress, the muscle man himself, Kemper Woodruff, the happy hoodlum in full effect. And tonight we have the unsung hero of our generation. I really want to get into the history behind marijuana that got lost in time that a lot of people haven't heard of. The man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Paul Stanford. Hi, Paul.
Right. Hey, thank you. Thanks for having me, Kemper. I've known Kemper since he was about 6 years old, I think.
Yep, 5 or 6.
Wow.
Yeah.
Used to take him to school.
I took him to see Rush once.
Yeah, and Sting.
And Sting, that's right.
Oh wow, that's
It's
cool.
funny. I was thinking about that. I was like, dude, we were front row, and I'll never forget those shows.
Yeah,
So-
that was a good. I tried. If I had the money, then I was able to buy really good seats.
Yeah. And, for those that don't know, we want to get into what you've done in your career. There's probably way more than we can fit into this podcast, so we're just going to dive right in. Paul is the founder of the THCF. He's also been the host of Cannabis Common Sense. Since when did you start that show? Was that in the 90s?
October 1996.
Yeah. Almost since I was born. Like I was 1 year old running around. So,
yeah.
And you're really the hero of the marijuana advocacy movement. And so I really want to know, we're going to go way back to the beginning and start with what was your childhood kind of like and how did you first get introduced to marijuana?
Well, I grew up in Dallas, Texas. My mom had divorced my father when I was a baby. I didn't really know that. I only met him a couple of times, though he lived to be in his 80s. She raised me single, and then she got married again when I was about 3. And they didn't have a good relationship. They were on again, separated, and when he died. And so I was about 11 when that happened. Because she was a nurse, full-time nurse, she worked a lot, and so I went to a babysitter in the evening. And one of the babysitters' son had come home from Vietnam. So when I was 11, he was 26. We first smoked a couple of joints in the babysitter's garage. And so that's what I remember. And the first times I bought marijuana a few years later, I bought it from him. But I bought my first amount of marijuana when I was 13. And back then, when I lived in Dallas, a pound of marijuana was about $110. And so I ended up smoking most of it, though. And I didn't make money, but we had some big parties. And so
awesome.
when later in my teenage years, when I moved to Asheville, North Carolina, I started buying Colombian cannabis. When I was a kid in Texas, it was Mexican. And I made money at that for a couple of years, from about the age of 16 to 19. I made pretty good money selling ounces and quarter ounces for $10 to $40 for an ounce back then. 35. Yeah. I undercut the market. Most ounces were going for $40. I sold them for 35. And so I made broke into the market that way. But then when I was 18, just as I turned 18, there was a news story about an upcoming event in Washington, D.C. called the White House Smoke-In. And so a week after my 18th birthday, I got to Washington, D.C. and went to this huge, to me it seemed huge, 10,000 people smoking marijuana in front of the White House and the Washington Monument. And so that was my first introduction to that. And then
hold on,
when
hold
I
on.
first moved,
Was anyone arrested at this event? I have never heard of this. Okay, how did
it
this
still
go
goes
down?
on. It still goes on. But yeah, when there's 10,000 people, there's a limited amount of people the police can arrest. In fact, we would actually chant, bust us, because they couldn't bust 10,000 people. There were 10 cops on horses, 10 cops on motorcycles, 10 cops on horses, 10 cops on motorcycles, lining the whole front of the White House. And so there I met, or saw more accurately, some other people who I later worked with. And so I didn't really do much anything else. But then when I moved to the Northwest when I was 21, I'd been in the U.S. Army, joined when I was 19, tore the cartilage in my knee while training, got out after about 8 months. That made me a disabled veteran. I got out with a medical discharge, and I still actually get a disability check every month, and I get to go to the VA hospital for medical care.
So,
And so I
what made
I
you
used
want to
my
join?
huh?
What made you want to join the military?
I wanted to get out of North Carolina. I was living, I had grown up in Dallas, which is a big city, and I'd moved to Asheville. And I didn't like moving to Asheville at the age of 15, but I did, and so my mom wanted me to get out of the pot situations. I was, she knew that I was smoking marijuana and whatnot and be close to her family. So we moved to North Carolina. And I just had a feeling, I'd been selling marijuana for a couple of years, and I had a feeling that if I stayed there, I was going to get busted for selling more marijuana in North Carolina. So I thought I wanted to join the Air Force. They wanted me to enter code all day, and that did not seem appealing to me, deciphering code all the time. But I saw an Army recruiter, and the Army recruiter said, "How would you like to go to Hawaii?" And I said, "Oh, I really would like to go to Hawaii." I had heard at that time that they had really good marijuana in Hawaii. And so, and they did. And so I went and I went into the Army, and I tore the cartilage in my knee while training on the Big Island of Hawaii. And they offered me a choice of getting a new job or because I was in a combat unit. I didn't realize I was going into a combat unit either. They said they wanted me to be a cannon crewman. And I said, "Well, what does a cannon crewman do?" I didn't know about combat. They go, "Oh, they fire cannons like at ceremonial occasions." And in fact, they do fire cannons like 21 gun salutes. I never participated in one of those, but I know people who did back then. But cannons are the field artillery that you bomb the other people while they try to bomb you and wipe them out. So it's direct combat. But I trained for that, and I did it for a few months. When I tore the cartilage in my knee and they said, "You can get out," I said, "Let me out." I had traded in one parent, my mother, for anybody with a higher rank than me could tell me what to do, and I was very happy to escape. I didn't realize I would become a disabled vet and get these benefits I have. So, but then I used those disabled vet benefits to go to school, and I went to school for a total of about 8 years. But when I first moved to the Northwest, I got a book by a guy named Abbie Hoffman, and Abbie Hoffman was the organizer of the Yippies. And the Yippies are the people who organized the White House Smoke-In and a number of other pro-marijuana events. So at the end of the book, it said, "Contact this guy, Dana Beal, in New York City." And I did, and I became a contact in their newspaper, which was called Overthrow. And so it had codes in it that told you how to make free phone calls. And then phone calls were a lot more expensive. Long distance phone calls were very, very expensive. You could spend literally hundreds or thousands of dollars a month on your phone bill if you weren't careful making long distance phone calls. So this would actually, with certain codes, you could charge your phone call to the American Nazis. You could charge it to the Ku Klux Klan. You know, you could make up a number and just charge it to nobody. And so that's one of the aspects of that. But I became, first I was a Yippie organizer. I organized what they call, it was back when Ronald Reagan was president. So I got the permits for, and I was living in Washington State, I got the permits for this Rock Against Reagan tour that went around to about 30 different cities. And I got the permits for the Seattle Center, where the Experience Music Museum is there next to Space Needle now, but then it was an open field, and to the Capitol in Olympia. So I organized those, and then I contacted in Washington, D.C., the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. And pretty soon they said, you are now our state director. I sent them a couple letters. I guess this guy, Kevin Zeese, a lawyer, was pretty impressed. They sent me a big 16 millimeter reel of the movie Reefer Madness. So I then took that movie and I started showing it first at Evergreen, then the University of Washington, and various universities around there. But I found out that there was and I talked about doing a marijuana initiative in Washington State so we could legalize marijuana. I'd met this guy, Jack Harrer, in '82, who was working on marijuana initiatives in California. And so in 1984, both he and I moved here to Portland to work on a marijuana initiative here that had almost made the ballot in '84, but it had been cheated off the ballot, actually. Okay. That helped us make the ballot the next year in 1985. We started gathering signatures in June, and we made the ballot by the 1st of November. And a lot of people who signed, and I gathered about 1,200 signatures on that and got my friends to do it. And we turned in our signatures on November 1st of 1985 for a vote in November of 1986, more than a year away. That is still the earliest any initiative has made the ballot in Oregon State. And it was the second time that legalizing marijuana had ever been voted on. In 1972, California had the first vote of an initiative to legalize marijuana, and they got 32% of the vote. And so we put it on the ballot in '85. Then the whole Reagan administration came down on our heads. Nancy Reagan, Ronald Reagan's wife, had started this Just Say No program. And she came to the state for 3 days and toured it to build opposition against us. And then at the time, George H.W. Bush Sr., you might say, he was the vice president for Ronald Reagan, and he came and spent 2 whole weeks touring the state to campaign against us.
Hold on. We got so much to unpack. We have so much to unpack in that. You are incredible. So I'm going to bounce back to this. So we're going to remember George H.W. Bush Sr. But so you and Jack Harrer, because anyone that's smoked weed, especially in the Northwest, has come across the strain Jack Harrer, right? So I'm very curious. You guys moved, and you guys were neighbors, correct?
Yeah. We lived, Timmy was actually born right across the street from the house Jack lived in. All 3 of my kids, Timmy being your friend and our youngest, he was born right across the street from where Jack had written the first edition of his book, The Emperor Wears No Clothes. So Jack became pretty famous with that Emperor Wears No Clothes. High Times magazine publicized it. Anyway, this guy in the Netherlands, Ben Drockers, who's a friend of mine today, I stayed at his house in Thailand for about a week last December of 2022. He has a business. He has a couple businesses that are the biggest of their kind in the world. One is called Cincy Seeds, and they have been selling marijuana seeds since the 70s. And then in about, I guess 1995, he started Hip Flax. And now Hip Flax makes all the body parts, the interior molding for all the German automakers, Audi, Mercedes, Volkswagen, BMW. So if you get one of those cars, all the molding under the leather is made from hemp now. But he also sells his hemp to a paper maker that makes it in, one paper maker makes it into cigarette papers. Most people don't realize that tobacco cigarettes are rolled in hemp or flax paper. It's about 50-50. Flax is linen and hemp, is marijuana. And so flax and hemp are very similar in their fiber and in their seed, oil, and protein. And so Jack, at the time in 1985, was working on his book, the first edition of The Emperor Wears No Clothes, The History of Marijuana. And at that time, Jack had 3 little kids that were ages 6, 5, and 3. Now, in 1985, no one had a desktop computer, and certainly no desktop publishing. And so he was doing cut and paste, scissors, and glue. Jack's book has a lot of pictures in it from newspapers and old magazines and stuff. So his kids were getting all into his papers, and he asked if he could come to my house about 3 blocks away and put together his book. So I let him come over and put his book together. But Ben Drockers with Cincy Seeds decided to name a strain after him, the Jack Hare strain. And it ended up winning the Cannabis Cup Awards from High Times there in Amsterdam a few times. That strain did.
Wow.
And so a lot of people think Jack Hare must have been a grower, but my friends and I, we grew marijuana in our basement, but Jack didn't really participate. He trimmed marijuana sometimes, but he didn't really participate in the cultivation of it.
Okay, you're blowing my mind with that. So Sensei Seeds, is that where Sensei Star came from?
No, it's Cincy. So Sensi, Cincy, which is part of the name for seedless marijuana. Cincy means without. Yeah, and so Sensimilla means without seeds. And so it came from that without part of the Spanish, Sensimilla, which is seedless marijuana, a name for seedless marijuana. Okay, and so that's where the name Cincy Seeds came from. But he named that in the 70s. Ben Drockers did. Ben Drockers is a very, very wealthy guy today, as you can imagine, with the biggest seed company and the biggest hemp company in the world.
So when
in fact, the money in the European Union is made with his hemp. It's 70% hemp and 30% cotton. And so he supplies the hemp fiber for the money throughout the European Union.
That is super baller. So when did the High Times and like cannabis culture kind of come into play? And at that time, where was the THCF and you and your agenda?
Well, I had come to Oregon to work on marijuana legalization. It was called the Oregon Marijuana Initiative. And so that's what I did. And so I was, 23, 24 at the time. And so I was when I came here, I decided, well, I'm going to help. I know what I can do. I can go sell ads. They had a newspaper called the Marijuana Report. So not only did I gather signatures, I went and sold ads to grow shops and head shops to make money for the newspaper and myself. And so that's what I moved here to help with. So there's already a structure in place. But by 1988, I had decided that they needed to set up an initiative to sell marijuana. So I started working on the wording on how to do that. And then in 1990, I started campaign for the restoration and regulation of hemp, a political committee. And then in 1999, that's when I started the Hemp and Cannabis Foundation, which is the name of THCF. And so at the time, I set it up as a nonprofit, and we got our 501c3 status from the IRS to be listed as a nonprofit. I was doing my cable TV show already, and we were putting out a newspaper called Hemp News, and I was selling hemp paper. So I kind of used that to promote my hemp paper company. So I haven't talked about my history with hemp paper. So in 1986, I started to go back to school again. I had graduated from Evergreen State College in '83, but I got busted for growing pot, and they said you have to have a job or go to school. And so I went back, and because I'm a disabled veteran, I got paid to go to school. And so they paid for my books, they paid my tuition, and so I went back to Portland State and I started studying Chinese. And the reason I'd always had a real interest and fascination in Chinese culture. At that time, China was the good communist country compared to Russia, which was the bad communist country, or the Soviet Union. That's what it was called then. But so I studied Chinese, and I went to school in an exchange program through Portland State University, first in Zhengzhou University, later in Beijing University. And I learned Chinese, and I went and I found sources for hemp paper and hemp fabric. Hemp fabric is canvas, that you can make all kinds of cloth out of it. Some of it's blended with silk, makes a real fine cloth. But anyway, so in 1989, I started importing hemp paper and hemp fabric from China. And my first container load, I actually grew a bunch of marijuana, and I sold it, got like $16,000 and paid for a cargo container load of hemp paper. And it was shipped here to Portland. The customs people made a lot of jokes, that the dogs went crazy on this or something, but eventually it's paper and didn't have any THC in it. And so tobacco is rolled in hemp paper. Most people, like I say, don't know that. I became an expert on non-wood paper, not just hemp, but other forms of non-wood paper, from waste of sugar cane or bagasse and wheat straw and other things. So I started a company called Tree Free Eco Paper. And we made a big change in the paper industry. We got a lot of publicity. We were covered first in the Chicago Tribune, then the New York Times and the Washington Post. And we made a lot of inroads into the environmental community. I worked with Greenpeace and the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club put us in these big full-page ads in their monthly magazine. And the Sierra Club magazine back then was considered like one of the most influential publications in America. It was right up there with the New York Times and whatnot. So they gave us advertising, and I sold hemp paper primarily up until '97. And paper is a capital intensive business. I needed to raise millions of dollars, and Timmy was around by '97. So I decided I needed to do something else to be able to, because at that point we had 3 little kids and I wasn't making enough to pay all the bills. So I went back to school, got student loans until we legalized medical marijuana in a vote in 1998 here in Oregon. California had passed medical marijuana in a vote, an initiative petition in 1996. And then Oregon became the second state to legalize medical marijuana in 1998.
What was your involvement with that?
Well, I helped gather signatures. I encouraged it. I was doing my TV show. There was at KATU, Channel 2 here in Portland, they had a weekly show back then called Town Hall, where they'd bring in like 20 people for and 20 people against various issues. So a couple nights before the election in 1998, I'd been on the show before. They had like these 2 teams of 20 people, but there'd be 2 people on each side in what they called the hot seat. So I was in the hot seat on a couple of those shows. Now my office is just down the road from the KATU studio, I actually, on Facebook, I post my invitation that I got from KATU to that show. But while I was on that show, I met a doctor named Dr. Philip Levesque. And he was actually an older guy. At that time, he was about 75. And I was just like 38, and which seems young to me. But now, but he came on my TV show. And then in May of 1999, medical marijuana became legal on May 1st of 1999. People started showing up at the TV studio to meet with Dr. Levesque so he could sign their medical marijuana authorizations. Soon our studio was getting overwhelmed with people coming in, like 30 people would show up to get him to do that. So I ended up first renting a couple of other spaces. I actually did one clinic in a community police station, and the police were coming in and out while we were seeing medical patients. But eventually I rented an office in 2001, and we overwhelmed that office immediately, and I had to move to a bigger office and then a bigger office with my THCF medical clinic, and it really boomed as a business. And so that's kind of how medical marijuana came about. But there were a lot of different people working on medical. It wasn't just me by any means, but I definitely was one of the leaders.
So, okay. Who are some people that you feel need to get some shout outs in that haven't gotten it, that the world might not know about? And what were they debating? Like, what were these topics of controversy that they had you debating at that time?
Well, the opposition would always say it's going to put marijuana in the hands of kids, and this is going to cause people to go crazy and do things. But some of the people I moved here to help were Dr. Fred Orther, who's still around, and John Sajo, and Greg Mahalik. Those are some of the people that were working on marijuana legalization when I first came to Oregon.
Okay.
And so they were kind of my mentors. I met some others like Dr. Todd McArea. I met him at the White House smoke-in 78, but he was like one of the first medical marijuana doctors in the nation. And he got a lot of flack for that at the time. But those are some of the people who deserve a shout out.
What was
a small number?
Yeah, right. What was making the doctors turn that you had come across, like the beginning doctors? What was it that they were seeing? And I guess, do you think that marijuana?
Everybody was smoking marijuana, and most people are in the closet, since the 60s, and so they didn't want to come out. But Dr. Levesque, he wasn't really a marijuana smoker. He was a World War II infantry soldier. He had fought his way under fire, crossing the Rhine, and marched across. He was a scout in the infantry. And he ended up, or maybe you don't know, he had a PhD from Oregon Health Sciences University in pharmacology and toxicology. And he ended up teaching those subjects at 10 different medical schools. And he brought that up in that town hall show. And he mentioned that, marijuana was a medicine. He'd had a big jug of marijuana cough syrup in the pharmacy at OHSU. And it had been a medicine up to the 1930s. So when he was there at OHSU, Oregon Health Sciences University, they hadn't cleaned all that stuff out. And he ended up finding it and studying it and decided, this stuff helps a lot of different things. So he was actually on that town hall show. He was in the group of people who were against marijuana legalization. When he stood up and said he was in favor of it, it kind of surprised me. But I just figured he would be a guest one time on my show, and he came on to co-host the show and later helped me set up our clinics to help medical marijuana patients. And so that is how it started. He was already in favor of it. So then I looked around for another doctor because we were overwhelming Dr. Levesque. And I met a nurse practitioner who worked up at the VA hospital. And she came in to help Dr. Levesque during our clinics. And her husband was also an MD from Providence Hospital, and he came and started working for us here in Oregon. And so, and then I had people come from across the river in Washington State saying, we need a doctor in Washington. We need a doctor in Washington. So I put an ad in the Washington State Medical Association's monthly newspaper that said, looking for a part-time doctor, flexible hours, no stress. And I had about 10 people write. And one of them was a retiring heart surgeon from Yakima. And so he came on board and helped me open our clinics in Washington State. And then later I opened in Hawaii, and then I opened in Colorado. Then I opened in Montana. And when Dr. Todd McMaria passed away in California, I took over his practice. He was the very first medical. And we opened an office down in Riverside in Southern California as well. And so we had lots of patients in Michigan when medical marijuana became legal in Michigan at the end of 2008. I opened immediately. That was my tactic, is as soon as marijuana became legal, I would go and start advertising and be kind of the first person. So like in Colorado, from 2005 until 2008, we were the only marijuana business that was legal in the state of Colorado. And then things started to boom. And so I opened also in Arizona, had an office for a few years in Phoenix, which is where Timmy's at now.
So where when doctors were getting into this, were they able to just be pulled from any practice, like as long as you have DR in front of you?
They had either an MD medical doctor or a DO, doctor of osteopathy, they could sign these medical marijuana applications. And so as long as they had those two licenses from the state of Oregon, then they could do it. And so, you know, in the end, I think to date, I've worked with about 45 different doctors and altogether across 9 states. And I've helped 270,000 patients get their medical marijuana permits. And in probably about 2010 till 2016, we were making $3 to $6 million a year gross. And so about 15% of that was profit. And so I started to take that money, and first I started growing medical marijuana and giving it away for free because you couldn't sell it. And so I grew, nobody could afford to do it. According to my accountants, I was spending about $150,000 a year to grow and give away free marijuana. And in addition, of course, and my wife got free marijuana too. And I complained when I found out Timmy was stealing some and taking it to school. I told him, you can't do that. You're going to you're going to be taken away. You know,
I'm sorry. I was the benefactor.
I know.
You fucking hoodlum.
And so I guess there's a lot of things I want to touch on. One,
hey, happy 420.
Happy 420,
Happy 420,
baby. So a funny thing just about growing up is, as a child, me and Timmy did not understand what marijuana was. Like, I remember seeing it as a beautiful alien-looking flower that I'd never seen anything else like it, and I just knew your house smelled funny. And so that was the extent that I knew of when I was little. But I remember certain names on the calendar, like the strawberry coughs and different strains that came out. So what were some of the like original strains when it changed from just, you know, Thai weed, Mexican weed, you know, Canadian?
Skunk was the first, and it smelled like a skunk, you know, and so I still kind of like the smell. I didn't before like the smell of skunks, but after that I came to kind of like that smell. But there's a strain called AK-47 was another really popular strain. White Widow was another early strain of cannabis.
That's phenomenal. I have not been able to find White Widow. And like a reason I'm asking you this is I'm really curious where you think genetics are going, because
They're all blending together all the time. You know, it's
yeah,
hard to find the original varieties. I know one guy in San Francisco, he's an old activist, Todd McCormick, who's working with an old famous marijuana breeder guy, Robert Connell Clark, who's written some books on cannabis botany. But they have some of those original strains. So they're the guys to go to for those old strains. But now it's all about developing new strains, and new strains are coming out all the time. Like I saw lemon cherry gelato is a new strain that's just come out that's really hot. There's a business down that I have bought clones for my medical garden a few years. I'm going to go there on Monday to pick up 3 strains. But if you look them up, it's Capricorn. No C's are in that. It's Capricorn with 2 K's .us. And that's their website. But after that, just go /strain info. No space or hyphen in there. And they will list just all these different strains with photos and test results and grower testimonials. And they sell clones pretty cheap. Right now, they're going between $8 and $11. And their clones are very, very healthy. So I've been picking up clones from there and from friends here in the local area.
yeah.
I've won lots of awards for my medical marijuana. One year in 2008, I swept the Oregon Medical Marijuana Awards. And I won first, second, third, fifth, and I won all these ribbons too. There were like 100 different growers. But somehow that year we had this, a friend of mine who helped me. He had this big African tortoise, and we fed the tortoise certain food and then used the tortoise poop to fertilize the garden. And that apparently was one of the big. I've always been an all organic grower. When I first moved to Oregon in '84, I found out everybody was growing marijuana, so I soon became involved in growing marijuana. I met a lot of people like John Sajo actually taught me to start with, but he introduced me to Jorge Cervantes and Ed Rosenthal, 2 people who've written a lot of books about marijuana cultivation. So I learned from their books too. And I became a source for them in terms of photos and things. In fact, if you go to Jorge Cervantes' book, Cannabis Encyclopedia, and you turn to page 100, there's a picture of me there with a couple big plants that are about to be harvested. But so I'm in the Cannabis Encyclopedia. But have you ever heard of Jorge Cervantes or?
I've heard of Rosenthal.
Ed Rosenthal? Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I guess I have a question, because when I first got into the medical industry, right, I was barely 19, I want to say, and I had gotten my card, so thank you. And so I was going around to all the different dispensaries, and because it was just medical, there were totally different rules and regulations.
Right.
And so I was not only able to consume on some premises, but they would give you like sample packs. And I remember the strains being these original strains. And shortly thereafter, I got into a dispensary myself, right? And when I was working, what I was noticing is that the care that went into cultivating these strains was so intense, because it was still illegal. So the people that were doing it, a lot of them were kind of rolling the dice, and people that were medical patients could sell to the dispensaries themselves. And so one person who, like, I remember this old dude loved Blue Magoo, and he had the best Blue Magoo. And it was like, all right, we would buy that. And that was like, he was growing his medicine that worked for him. And that was what was coming to the shelves. So I say this to ask, do you think that recreational marijuana has kind of ruined an aspect of the industry on the quality of bud because of the quantity of production?
Yeah, I find that when I don't buy much because I grow my own, but in fact, in the past year, I just had one purchase. I bought an 8 from the only Native American owned dispensary here in Portland. It's Natural Wonders right next to the Fred Meyer at 39th or Cesar Chavez and Hawthorne. But, and I thought mine was better. I didn't like, even though this one said it was gassy and was one of the nicest strains, I think mine's better. But I quit smoking marijuana about 25 years ago. I mainly vaporize. I smoke in some social situations, I'll just take a puff or two. I think I had a puff last week with somebody who had a joint. But after using my Volcano vaporizer for many years now, I've become accustomed to it, and I appreciate that. I don't cough as much. It doesn't smell as strongly. You get the real flavor of the flower and the terpenes. So I prefer vaporization, and it's a lot better for your lungs.
Yes, for sure. I don't want to see what the inside of my lungs look like after cleaning my bong plenty of times.
Well, the thing is with most of the vapor pens, they have a carrier in them. So what you're inhaling isn't always cannabis. It's, the really good ones have terpene as the carrier. A lot of the others have a lot of different chemicals. And so you're inhaling whatever it is they put into those little, cartridges for the pens. But I put my own homegrown flower into the Volcano, and it pumps hot air through it at about 360 degrees. And that vaporizes the resin and all the plant oils. And so you don't have any combustion byproducts. And so you don't cough nearly as much. And also because of that, your lungs don't get black stuff in them, When you're smoking, most of what you're inhaling are combustion byproducts. What really gets the medicinal or the high effect is the vaporization that takes place just before it burns. And so that is, once it burns, it's destroyed. There was a study in England about 22 years ago, and it compared a Volcano vaporizer, a bong, a pipe, and a joint. And they said a water pipe, a bong, destroys 75% of the medicine in the burning process before you can inhale it. So you're only really getting, because it burns it more quickly, you're only getting the THC that vaporizes before it burns. Once it burns, it's gone and destroyed. A handheld pipe destroys about 60% of the THC, and a joint was the most efficient way to smoke, and it only destroys about 50%. And so a Volcano, a vaporizer, doesn't destroy any. And what you're inhaling is almost pure THC, and terpenes, and other things.
So, in terms of the many ways to medicate, because I know, I've gotten a tincture from you that was bar none the best tincture I've ever had. How did you in the beginning, especially before there was as much prevalence or variety of products from producers in the market, start to diagnose, you should make edibles with this, you should make an oil? How are you?
Just read. I still like to read a lot. And so I read about the benefits of edibles and how edibles work better for a number of conditions, because you don't have to do it all the time. An edible dose you can just take 3 times a day, where with smoking, you're going to have to do it all through the day, So edibles are more long lasting, and it's a completely different effect. For pain, spasms, and seizures, edibles actually work better.
And, when you were younger and you were consuming marijuana, would you consider marijuana a truly psychedelic experience? And what do you think it does to the consciousness?
I think it, what I really, it makes you giggle and laugh and have fun. And that was my impression and in the 70s, when I first started using marijuana, it was kind of a counterculture thing. All younger people were using marijuana. It was very prevalent. I mean, the majority of people. And so, and it was widely accepted, and everybody expected it to be legal very soon, and like I said, California was the first state to vote on it in 1972. But between 1973, so California voted it down in 72, in 73, Oregon became the very first state to decriminalize marijuana, where it had been a felony to have possession of any. They made it an ounce or less was just an infraction, a traffic ticket. And so soon 9 other states had decriminalized marijuana, taken the crime out of it, and made it more like an infraction, which isn't even breaking the law. It's like speeding or running a stop sign. And so then the whole Reagan administration turned that around and started. First, they stopped Jimmy Carter, who was working for marijuana legalization, really, and so they got his drug czar, the first drug czar with him, Peter Bourne. He got outed for using cocaine at a marijuana party, and pretty soon he had to get fired. And then Carter wasn't going to touch it again until after he got reelected. And instead of him getting reelected, we got Ronald Reagan, and the Reagan administration was dead set against marijuana. And George Bush, being part of the CIA, they make their money off of shipping cocaine and drugs to the United States to fund all their black operations for the intelligence agencies.
Yeah.
And so they wanted to keep that money train flowing, and they still have it flowing for other drugs, but they aren't doing as much of these black ops anymore. They did back then.
I tell you what, they must have caught Jimmy Carter's guy like, "Sir, sativas do not go up your nose, and they don't make you act like that."
Yeah.
There's also a story that I remember you telling me when I was younger about you being in the military, while we're kind of talking about back in the day stuff, about you standing in front of a train. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah, no, I was not in the military when that happened. I was only in the military for 8 months when I was 19 years old. And so I got out of the military while I moved back to North Carolina. And then in 81, I moved to Washington State. My mom had moved there because her brother's wife had died during open heart surgery. He had little kids, so she moved up there. So I followed her up and started going to Evergreen State College. And so while I was working with the Yippies and their overthrow newspaper, and working as the normal state director for the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws in Washington State, I saw that there was a train, and it was on the news. Back then there were just 3 main networks of television. It was even before Fox TV, and so at most you would, if you had cable, you might have 50 channels. If you didn't have cable, you had 2 or 3 or 4, depending on where you lived. And so there were news stories about this train that was carrying hydrogen bomb warheads from Texas to the Trident submarines on the Puget Sound in Washington State. And so I saw there were these protests in Colorado and Montana. Then my local newspaper said that there was this Methodist minister, Jeffries was his name. He was organizing a protest in Elma, Washington, and they were gonna, protest the hydrogen bomb warheads that are going to the Trident submarines. At that time, a lot of people complain about the economy today. Well, the economy in the late 70s and early 80s became highly inflationary. Inflation was like 10 times more than what it is today. Like today, we have 3.84% inflation. Back then, inflation was like 16, 17, 18% a year. It was much, much greater. And so prices were going up. And there was huge recession as well. Hard to find jobs, much harder than it is today. It was the worst recession until the banking collapse back in about 2007, 2008. But the inflation was much greater than it's been since. It hasn't been that high in the United States since then. There are other countries that have higher inflation rates, but not here in the U.S. But anyway, so I had a sign that I picked up. Somebody else had made it. Said, "We want jobs, not bombs." And so I carried that there. And so I went to Elma, and I went to this protest, And then I found out a lot of the protesters were going to 2 more protests, including one at the gates of the Trident submarine base in outside of Bangor, Washington. And so I got a ride in Elma to these other protests. So when I got to the protest site at the gates to the Trident submarine base outside Bangor, Washington, there were about 150 protesters, but there were probably 200 reporters from all over the world because it had been like the lead story. And there were helicopters and airplanes going around. And so the train kind of came around the corner in a bend and you could see it. Then everybody moved toward the train tracks. And the police held people back and they were arresting people. I kind of held back and stood with my sign and I watched. And then I saw that most of the cops were busy. So then I just kind of walked nonchalantly and I walked around people. And I was the only person that actually made it to the train tracks that day. And they arrested me and charged me for attempting to obstruct or delay a train, which at the time was a Washington State misdemeanor. Later, they charged people with federal felonies with long prison terms. And one guy in California, Brian Wilson, he got run over and lost his legs. So it was a series of protests, but that's how I got. And then I wrote an article about it for the Yippie newspaper Overthrow called Blocking a Payload of Death. And so you can search, I put that article out on the internet. If you search for Blocking a Payload of Death, you will find that article and it'll give you more details than I can.
And did you stop the train?
No. The cops asked me later if I was going to let the train run over me. I said, no, I was going to jump on top of it and climb up. That's what I wasn't going to let the train run over me. That's crazy, But I would have jumped on it and climbed it if I'd gotten close enough to it. But they got me, once they got you, I'm not going to fight them.
Yeah.
So they moved me back away from the track and said, stand here, and then took me to jail. I was one of 6 people to be arrested that day. And so they called us the Bangor 6.
Famous. You even got the cool name out of it.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, how did Hempstock get inspired, and when did you start taking hold of like your own events and go, you know what? I'm just going to, under the banner of the THCF and stuff, start these Hempstock events. Because I remember I've attended a bunch of them.
Yeah, we did about 13 of them. Well, I had been to other events, the White House Smoke-In in D.C. I'd been to this one event, the Great Midwest Marijuana Harvest Fest in Madison, Wisconsin. I first went to that in 88, and then in 89, I spoke there. That's the first time I got on a stage and spoke. And so then I started going to the Seattle Hemp Fest, and I decided we had tried to organize and we had organized a Portland Hemp Fest in the late 80s. We had, the first one was up at Mount Tabor in the crater and around there. And then we started doing them down on the waterfront in Portland. And actually, one year, I think it was 98, the Portland police did a counter protest to us. And we had one area at Waterfront Park next to Saturday Market, and they had just right next to us all these boats and planes and helicopters and Corvettes, that said DARE it was all about the DARE program then. Yeah. So then the people who were doing that quit doing it, and no one was doing one in Portland. And so I had the funds to get it going. I became a sponsor of the Seattle Hemp Fest, which was the biggest in the country. And so I started organizing the Portland one. I think it was about 2005 was the first one. Maybe it was 2004. And then we just became an annual event up until 2016. And then we had to stop because I had my company stolen, which is another long, complicated story. My company was stolen by rich people involved with the marijuana industry who wanted to take me out. They did take me out financially. And so Now
So-
all of my old medical records and everything are in the hand of this guy, George Soros. And George Soros actually financed taking me down. He was the guy who funded the first Washington State initiative. And he funded a lot of different things. I didn't know he was going to take me out. I thought he was going to help us. But he came in and said he was going to help our initiative, but didn't. And then he took our signatures and forged not him specifically, but his minions, so to speak. And they took our signatures and forged documents, and then they went into court when I was out of town and filed documents and stole my company. And when I tried to fight them, they bribed the judges. In fact, the judge who ended up giving away my company in a preliminary hearing, the prosecutor, the district attorney for Multnomah County, said that judge, Judith Matarazzo, was corrupt, and they weren't going to put any more criminal cases in front of her. And so the people who stole my company, they spent about $3 million and hired this law firm, Herbold, and they filed 35,000 pages of documents. How do you hire a lawyer to read 35,000 pages of documents? You know, I spent about 170,000 on lawyers and went broke, but they spent $3 million. Now all of our business contacts and everything, they actually also claim they own the strains of marijuana I grew, that because they claim they bought my business and I was growing White Widow, AK-47. I had about 27 strains under cultivation there for a while. Anyway, they said they own them because they bought my business. And so they go to people who are growing these strains and say, you can't use that name. We own that name. We bought it from Paul Stanford, you know? So not like I had the rights to White Widow and Trainwreck. That was another one that I liked and grew a lot.
Those are some of my favorite strains, but did that really like hurt your heart? And because I know in the beginning you really set out to do a lot of good, and you're still fighting the good fight, you know?
Yeah.
So
No, it did hurt my heart and hurt my ability to pay my bills. Before I could take, you know, my family on trips and work in all these different states and fund this free marijuana giveaway and gardens, and you know, they just impoverished me basically. Now I've just been fighting to you know, break even and pay my bills.
I want to know also, how can people help support you? Like, what do you need from the people at this point?
Well, you know, if somebody wants a medical marijuana permit, I'm still doing that. So they can call us at 503-235-4606. It's 503-235-4606. And in terms of, you know, just educate yourself is, you know, that's what I've been doing with my cable TV show. It's what you're doing with your podcast here. You know, educate people about the truth. You know, there's a lot of untruth out there. And you know, you just have to work for freedom, I think. You know, one of the things I was going to do after legalizing marijuana was make DNA open source code. And so I also was going to expand individual rights through the initiative process. Well, they didn't want me to do that either. So, you know, I can't afford hardly to do anything. I'm having trouble paying my bills. So
What do you believe the biggest benefit of open source genetics would be for plants?
Well, when I say DNA, I mean right now there are companies out there that say they own your DNA. They own all the DNA in the world, and they didn't create it. They patent these single DNA types because they're the first ones to file a patent on it. But I think that DNA wasn't created by these people, whether they created a new variety or not, and that it should be like Linux, open source code, so everybody has free access to benefit from it. And that was just one aspect I was working on. I was also working to make a state bank that's run by the state and finances the state government and the economy of the state. It's very successful in North Dakota. And so I want to emulate that. And so that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg. And I want people to have more rights than corporations and government. You know, back about 10 years ago, Citizens United was decided by the Supreme Court that says corporations are like people and have the same rights as people. Well, corporations can be immortal, and they have more rights. You know, a person can only give $2,000 to a political candidate, but a corporation can give infinite amounts of money. So it's really destroyed our political system and the freedom that we have to control our government.
What are some of the greatest talking points that you think aren't being talked about in regards to, you know, cannabis and how it affects society and the world at large? Because when I was going to hemp stock, even as a child, and me and Timmy just having fun running around, eating food and seeing all the bands play and stuff, I really did pay attention and listen. And I always would stop Timmy and go, no, we have to watch what your dad's saying. Like, and we would actually sit and watch you. And I remember you talking about renewable energy and, you know, the textiles and, you know, building materials like hempcrete and all these things. But what are some of the greatest talking points that you think are still relevant today that no one's talking about?
Hemp is the oldest crop. Agriculture actually started with hemp about 30,000 years ago, as far as we can tell. You know, anything more than 3,500 years old is hard for them unless it's carved in stone. You know, the documents have disappeared, so we don't really know about these ancient civilizations. But archaeologists can see that hemp was originally from an area in what's now Tajikistan, and it spread from that area all around the world, and it's the basis of many different religions and philosophies. And so hemp was cultivated and used in funeral rituals, even today in China. When the emperor of Japan is coronated, there are two sacred plants in Japanese culture, hemp and rice. And so when the Japanese emperor is coronated, they have to use hemp in the coronation process. The Buddha was said to have been enlightened while he was sitting under a tree, and he only, according to myth, he ate one hemp seed a day for 3 years before he became enlightened and became the Buddha. And so, and then there's actually a church, a Catholic church on the island of Sicily that has a lot of hemp. It shows God in our Garden of Eden, and they showed that when Eve and Adam ate the apple, the hemp plant appeared. And then anytime God or Jesus were healing people or talking to them, the hemp plant would be represented. There's about 140 different pieces of art sealed under glass in gold leaf at this Monreal Cathedral in Palermo on the island of Sicily. So it's deeply embedded in all the world's major religions, you know, and so most people don't know that. And hemp protein is the most digestible and healthiest protein, has all the omega-3s, the essential fatty acids you need for your brain development and your health. So, you know, I've got some hemp wood right here that's harder than steel, and they're making flooring out of it. Just look up hempwood.com and you'll find out about that. And I also have some hemp plastic here that's completely biodegradable. It turns into dirt. It could solve so many of our problems. And in Wisconsin, they closed this old Ever-Ready battery plant, and they're using hemp fiber from the stems to make graphene and batteries now. And that should be coming out in a couple of years. So just about anything you can make with petroleum, hemp can make more than 100,000 different products. Environmentally, sustainably. We don't have to cut down forests. We can feed the world's hungry. We can have medicine that's superior to many of the pharmaceutical drugs out there. And so I am still a proponent of marijuana legalization and more hemp products.
Do you think that marijuana came from God or from aliens? Where do you think it came from?
It came from Central Asia. I mean, you know, it all depends on your interpretation. I am personally, as you may know, my wife is very devout Christian, but I am more of an agnostic myself. And so I think it probably evolved there, you know, from other plants, what I think. But, you know, it's at least, you know, it started spreading out of this area where it's indigenous area in Central Asia about 30,000 years ago. And now it's spread all around the world. And so it's definitely one, and it's the very foundation of agriculture itself. All archaeologists agree that hemp was among the very first crops grown by people and probably was the first one. And so people found this plant and they liked it and they liked the seeds and they found a use for the fiber and they used it medicinally. In fact, the oldest historian in Western civilization was the Greek historian Herodotus, who wrote about 4,000 years ago. And he talked about how these civilizations use cannabis. It's kind of like a hot box situation where they'd have a little dome tent. They'd have hot rocks in the middle of it, and they'd put marijuana flowers on top of it. There's actually a verse in the Bible that says that's the way to get in touch with God. When you take the flowers when they are ripe and smell like sour grapes, and
Isaiah 18.
it's Isaiah 18. My wife found
Isaiah.
that. Isaiah 18.
You know what's really cool is that I prayed about cannabis and God put the thought Isaiah 18 into my head and I looked it up and that's what he directly talks to me that way. So praise God.
Praise God, baby. That's so awesome. I'm happy that you're there as well. So I didn't know you were behind the camera. So we also
She wasn't. She just came in the door here about 10 minutes ago.
Oh, perfect.
She's over here. She's got the volcano vaporizing going on. Saying, no, I'll wait.
Fire up, baby. You know, I feel like she definitely needs to get some praise, you know, because she helped keep this whole thing together. She might be an unsung hero behind you in this story.
Oh, definitely. She's
undeniably so. The first lady of cannabis.
One of
them. You know, I've got a bunch more questions too. So sorry if I'm kind of tangential, jumping all over.
You think your people are going to listen this long? That's the question. But go ahead.
Look, this is history, and this is stuff that we need documented, for sure. Like I don't think you know how important you are to our generation, and I want our generation to know and be able to trace these facts because we can't have it lost to time. So I want to know, do you think there was a golden age of marijuana? Like when you think the strains were just perfect and the cultivation practices weren't too nutrient boost heavy or whatever like they might be today?
Not really. You know, it's easy to say things were better, but you know, when people were getting busted, you didn't know if they were spraying pesticide on the pot. I probably inhaled a lot of pesticide on pot. When I first went to the White House smoke-in when I was 18, the DEA was spraying this poison herbicide called paraquat on marijuana in Mexico. And the people in Mexico would cut it down, dry it, and send it to the United States with this herbicide on it. People would smoke that and their lungs would die and they would die, you know? So it's hard to say there's been a golden age yet. I think there's too much regulation today and too much corporatization, you know, how they stole my company. But that's America. It's the way the system's been set up, and we've got to change that system and give people more rights than corporations and even government. But that's going to take some more work.
You know, what do you think the media's role in this is, and do you think that they got some things right about potheads, say in movies like Cheech and Chong or something, and what is what they got radically wrong?
Well, the people who stood out like Cheech and Chong, they made fun of the issue, but they spread the idea that marijuana causes people to have fun. But a lot of intellectuals are closet smokers and still are, and so marijuana kind of enlightens you and puts you in touch with nature and helps. The Beatles said a lot of their music came out of using marijuana, but they were already famous musical pioneers, but it just kind of helped them expand their consciousness and create new sounds. So
what are some of your favorite people that you've ran into out of like maybe pop culture? Did you ever meet Bob Marley or Snoop or
No, I've got to meet probably most famously Willie Nelson. I've had quite a relationship. I've been the grower for Willie Nelson. I've given him hundreds of pounds of marijuana to him and his band. And so I know Willie Nelson really well. I got to spend a few days at Woody Harrelson's house back in the 90s. I really haven't had any contact with him since then, but I got to meet him. He's another person that's still pretty well known. I've met a lot of different folks that you probably wouldn't have heard of, but those are two names I know you recognize.
Right on. Do you have any like funny stories about where you realized I am too high for this situation right now?
Yeah, eating edibles, sometimes you can get too high with edibles. So there's that. Or with really strong oils and tinctures. So, basically when you eat too much, then I have trouble talking. It's like, it's like difficult to talk when you get really high on an edible. And so I have a number like Willie Nelson, I left some oil for his road manager, and Willie ended up taking a huge dose, and he couldn't talk for 2 days. That was when he had his house in Maui. So that's one funny story. But yeah, if you eat too much this oil, some people call it FECO, full extract cannabis oil, FECO. Other people call it Rick Simpson oil because Rick Simpson helped popularize it. But it's a very powerful medicine, and it's easy to overdose on that. Not where you're gonna die or anything, but you will get real sleepy and you won't be able to talk for a while.
So I was actually going to ask about Rick Simpson. Did you ever have the chance to meet him?
Yeah, I met him in Santiago, Chile. We were both speakers at Expo Weed in Santiago, Chile back in 2015. So I did get to meet him there, and I have an autographed copy of his book.
Wow. Random fun fact, because I know you're into, Eastern cultures and stuff. Where'd you get into collecting swords from?
Oh, I was interested in Chinese culture, and I had extra money, and I just decided to start picking up. I think I have about 10 or 12 or something. I know my kids, other people played with them, put a lot of dings in them and whatnot. But I have a couple old samurai swords, old Civil War swords. I would just buy neat antiques. And so now I'm trying to sell those things off. That's how you can help me. Buy my antiques, or I have some really rare records. A couple of them are worth thousands of dollars. So I got to sell those.
Okay. So are you an indica or a sativa guy?
I like the wake up more. I like them both. It's hard to find pure breeds anymore. Nobody's growing pure breeds. They're all hybrids. Some of them are sativa dominant, some of them are indica dominant. I like the ones that wake me up, so more sativa. For people who are prone to anxiety or something, that might not be good for them. But I'm not prone to anxiety.
Well, yeah, you're definitely one of the most chill people I've ever met in my life. Like, you're a historically chill figure. um, can you guys just, between the two of you, throw out like your top 10 strains that you guys remember having some fun smoking? Teresa, feel free to throw in a couple.
What do you want to say, Teresa?
Well, Lemon Pledge.
Lemon Pledge, I won first place in a few awards with my Lemon Pledge strain. It started as a cotton candy. I've lost that strain now. It tested with 20% terpenes. No other strain I've ever seen has even come close to that. And I won that year in 2008 when I swept the Oregon Medical Cannabis Awards. Lemon Pledge won first place, and it got put in like 200 different newspapers around America. I got calls from people, in Hawaii and New York that read it in there. It went out on the Associated Press wire. So it got printed in a bunch of different newspapers.
Like that Gorilla Glue.
Teresa liked Gorilla Glue. That's kind of a newer strain. I really like Trainwreck. That was one of my favorite strains I grew as well. White Widow and AK-47. But Trainwreck and Lemon Pledge were my favorites.
Yeah. I remember definitively the first time I smoked Trainwreck. I know one strain I really liked. I liked Blackberry Kush a lot for a highly sedative strain, and Old Bubba Kush. Bubba Kush was good.
I've grown Bubba Kush.
Yeah, that's a good.
I thought Strawberry Cough medicinally was one of the lighter strains with a really nice kind of floral taste to it.
Yeah, it has no flavor. I haven't seen it in years now.
Yeah.
When that whole corporate takeover thing happened, I couldn't afford to spend $150,000 a year on growing and giving away free marijuana anymore. I was stopped from entering the industry as a grower and couldn't get my license because I didn't have the money. But I lost all those strains because I couldn't clone them anymore. So now I don't have a veg room, so I just get strains and grow a few outdoors. I don't grow indoors anymore.
Do you think there's a place?
I think outdoors is better myself. Natural sun-grown cannabis, I think, is superior to indoor.
Do you think there's a place for small craft batch cannabis? Because
definitely. Just as there is for small, I think eventually it will be like the wine industry. In terms of there'll be a lot of little growers, they'll have their own little rooms to try, but right now it's overregulated, and there's no reason to regulate it the way it is because it's never killed anybody. It's never, most people cannot even commit a crime while they're on marijuana because they're feeling too good and happy to go do something like that, but.
I have a question for Zach now because, Zach, was I the first person that you ever indulged with marijuana with?
No. I had smoked once with my brother and my sister.
Okay.
Many years before that, but you got me absolutely ripped for my first time. And it was actually kind of ridiculous because we did it trying the very first episode of this podcast. 6 months before we actually launched.
How many episodes have you guys done now?
You'll be episode 116.
Okay, 116.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. So do you have any questions for Paul out of our repertoire of experiences?
I kind of wanted to go back, actually, and continue the George Bush story when he was touring Oregon and kind of finish up with that.
Yeah, he toured Oregon for 13 days. Most people I this is something that I don't know you know about, Kemper, but George Bush kind of led the team that assassinated John F. Kennedy. And so George H.W. Bush was one of the people involved. In fact, the head of the FBI at the time wrote a letter 2 days after the assassination of Kennedy that George Bush was in charge of the CIA in Dallas that day. And the CIA were definitely involved in that. Kennedy had been involved in the Bay of Pigs. It started during the previous administration, Dwight Eisenhower's administration, but the Bay of Pigs was an invasion of Cuba trying to overthrow Fidel Castro and the communist government there. So George Bush helped lead that, and they were really angry that Kennedy didn't send the Marines to invade Cuba and take it over. But George Bush is from an old money family. He was part of Yale's sorority, Skulls and
Skull and Bones.
Yeah, Skull and Bones. And so he's one of the evil people out there that subverted our government and led to what's going on today, is what I think. But George Bush was the first drug czar, official drug czar. Started the Office of National Drug Control Policy in the White House. And so he came to Oregon and toured Oregon for 2 weeks to build opposition to our initiative in 1985 and 86. And we lost overwhelmingly. I know I said California lost the first marijuana initiative with 32% in 1972. Oregon in 1986, we only got 27% of the vote. So we were crushed. And I actually got busted for growing marijuana in the middle of that. And it was used against the campaign. And so when they do a drug bust, they often lay out guns and drugs and money. Well, when my marijuana bust happened, they laid out Oregon Marijuana Initiative hats in our newspaper, the Marijuana Report, and our OMI t-shirts, like those were the equivalent of guns and drugs, I guess. But what else do you want to know about Bush and his family?
I don't know. That's a question for Zach. I was going to ask you, after having so much publicity, where you might have in the moment looked at it and been a little like mixed emotions about it. I guess you could have mixed emotions. Looking back on it, are you happy you went through all these things?
Oh yeah. I am. If I could change anything, it would be, dealing with those Canadians that came down and stole my company. That would be one thing. But yeah, I think that we've made a difference. People aren't going to jail. The industry started. A lot of people have jobs. My office is here on Sandy Boulevard. They call it the Green Mile. A lot of dispensaries up and down the block here. They kind of started surrounding us, back because we were one of the kind of the epicenter at first. And so I'm not happy with everything, but in general, you solve one problem and there's a whole new set of problems the next day, so it's inevitable. I think the real way to resolve things is to expand individual rights somehow. And I think the initiative process is one way to do that. Having a new constitutional convention for the United States would be a good way to change that. But the people who own the government and own the politicians, they don't want that to happen. So that's one of the reasons they took me out, because I was obviously working to change that, and they didn't want that to happen.
That was one of the things I was going to ask, in terms of do you feel that you were kind of targeted not only by our government, but what are some of the things that you're doing in other countries? And do you feel comfortable doing that or jeopardized?
No, I have been blessed to be able to go speak in other countries. Starting in 2013, after our initiative, in 2012, we were on the ballot in Oregon. They were also on the ballot. The Marijuana Policy Project had put marijuana legalization on the ballot in Colorado. And George Soros's group financed through the Drug Policy Alliance. They put the marijuana initiative on the ballot in Washington State. And so, what was the rest of your question there, Kemper? I'm a little distracted.
So, do you feel that you were kind of targeted? And
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've been targeted many times. I'm still targeted, Kemper. I still get prank phone calls. When I was busted for growing marijuana in 1991, because I was busted for growing twice, first in 86 and then again in 91. I went to court and fought it, and I was found not guilty of growing, even though I admitted I'd been doing it. It was a jury nullification case. For more information on that, here's another one. Search the web for How FIJA, F-I-J-A, How FIJA saved my life. And it will go into a lot more details than I can here right now. But I pled not guilty, and I was found not guilty of growing marijuana and just found guilty of simple possession of 2 grams of flower I had in my pocket, even though I'd been growing marijuana for several years. The jury realized that if I'd been found guilty of growing marijuana at that time, I would have had a 10-year mandatory minimum sentence, and Timmy never would have been born, you know. But fortunately, a jury of my peers here in Portland decided not to convict me of that. In fact, that jury wouldn't even convict me of the 2 grams of flour in my pocket. And in the end, I let the judge convict me just of the simple possession charge. The judge kind of liked me. The prosecutor, the federal prosecutor that tried to put me in prison for 10 years, he's my friend now. He says I was right. And he gave me some memorabilia from his work for the Justice Department and the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Oregon. And I've gone in and testified in some cases to help him quit marijuana defendants here over the past few years. So it's good to see, your opposition admit you were right.
Yeah, they came to the light and recognized where they were wrong. That's really cool.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you're advocating for in other countries?
Well, right. That was it. So because we were on the ballot in 2012, I first got invited to speak in Spain at an event called Expo Grow. And one thing leads to another. Soon I was invited to speak in Mexico and South America. I mentioned a while ago Expo Weed in Santiago, Chile. That is the biggest one in South America. But then I got invited to numerous ones in Colombia, all over Colombia. Sometimes I go in and I just talk about medical marijuana. Sometimes I talk about industrial hemp. I was a keynote speaker at the Southern Hemp Expo a few years ago and the Texas Hemp Expo. And so because of my history with hemp paper and fabric, sometimes I get to go in and judge contests across South America. I did a couple of hemp-only events, one in Kyoto, Japan, another one in Bangkok, Thailand, the International Hemp Environmental Forum. One of them leads to another, leads to another. So this weekend, today, I am speaking at the Chinook Winds Casino, Saturday, April 20th, 420, at 420. And I'll be talking about medical marijuana for disabled people, veterans, and senior citizens. So that takes place at the Chinook Winds Casino. And then I have another speaking gig in Boise, Idaho, where medical marijuana is even illegal, coming up at the Boise Hemp Fest on May 11th, Saturday, May 11th. So I still, like with your show, if you want me to be there, I'll try to be there.
That's so awesome. Zach, you look like you got something cooking, baby.
Well, so like in everything that people do, especially when it's not necessarily accepted at first, there's always barriers to it, and probably increasingly more difficult as time went on. But what were some of like your most memorable or the most significant barriers that you had to hurdle before you made progress?
Well, getting enough signatures to put it on the ballot and enough money to make a difference, those are the big barriers. Money in our society is the biggest barrier. And so that's one of the things. And then just educating people. When I first put marijuana legalization with a team of other people on the ballot in 1985 for that vote in 86, we lost overwhelmingly. But today that wouldn't happen. It's an educational process. We keep talking about it and telling the truth. And the fact of the matter is the science always backed us up. And so it was simply a matter of educating people. So educating people about why you are right, about what they think is wrong, is part of it. It's a long process. When I first went to that marijuana rally back in 1978, when I was 18 years old, I didn't know I'd be talking about it here. I'm going to turn 64 here in a few months. So here it is, almost 45 years later. And so I didn't know. Back then, we all thought it'd be legal in 5 years or less, But social change is slow and progress is slow. And you take one step forward, 2 steps back, you jump ahead a couple steps. It's like we passed the Civil Rights Amendment back in '64, but it just got overturned a couple of years ago. So every generation has to fight for freedom. And there are always going to be people who want to take us back, who don't like the changes, and there's people who are forward seeing and want changes to happen to benefit everybody. But those changes don't always turn out to be as beneficial. Like the corporations will step in and subvert your work to the best of their ability. So the barriers, though, by and large, are money and education.
Wow. To kind of piggyback on that, when you look at that initial experience you had, what was so impactful about marijuana to your state of being or your consciousness that kept you wanting to pursue this all that time?
Well, I just thought that they used marijuana to stop progressive political change. That's what I saw, is that marijuana drew people who wanted progressive political change to happen, and they used marijuana to slow social progress. And so that's what really motivated me, is marijuana is kind of a fulcrum, a hinge to the future of freedom. As long as they can criminalize something that doesn't really hurt you, that's safe and effective for the vast majority of people, that's a very useful medicine and environmentally productive, the most environmentally productive crop, as long as they could make that illegal and say it was evil, that we wouldn't be able to change anything. So I just decided to concentrate on that at an early age, and I like to have marijuana, and so I just kept working at it. I didn't know it would take so long, but once I'd started, I'm very persistent, and so that's been my motivation, is just to make the world a better place. I always believe from a very early age that future generations aren't going to remember us. In 100 years from now, maybe our direct ancestors might remember us, but you go back 2,000 years and you might be able to come up with 4 or 5 people you remember that are really well known outside of historians. So the best thing you can do is to change society to make it better for everybody else. And so that's what I looked at marijuana as being a key hinge to the future of freedom. And especially with the advent of artificial intelligence, the centralization of economic and political control, that marijuana can help decentralize that and put money back into the hands of people. When we can grow our own fuel, when we can, make all these different products much more environmentally friendly, like this biodegradable plastic I have over here, and this hemp wood product that's harder than steel. Now these things are actually starting to happen that were just dreams back then. And so, we said it could happen, and now it's finally starting to happen. And so we just need to deregulate it more and take power from the corporations and give it to the people. That's the big barrier, is the corporations and the richest people are going to fight to control our world. And we've got to steal that from them and take it back. And I think marijuana is one of our tools.
You are an incredible freedom fighter and peaceful warrior, my friend.
Well, thank you. I keep trying.
Yeah. Zach, I know you got more on your list too. So I got my list out of the way. I want you to bust them out.
So, I'm not like the biggest fan of big pharma. And so I was curious on how you would, I guess not compare, but what are your feelings in comparison to big pharma and how cannabis could change it or be a better replacement?
Well, that doctor who I mentioned earlier, Dr. Todd McArea out of California, he went to Reed College here in Portland too, but he said that big pharma is basically monomolecular mercantile madness. One molecule, mercantile, selling it, madness. So there's so many different ways to improve our health. And, in some ways it can be helpful, but I think that it's become too much just about money, and they don't care what happens to the people who have adverse effects as much. They need to examine that. And in terms of pharmacology, cannabis needs to be taught in medical schools, and they need to research it more. And even though it's so much highly researched today, they need to find how it helps kill cancer, how it helps control homeostasis, all the body's natural bodily processes. So cannabis mimics one neurotransmitter that's been named amandanide, and it goes against the flow of all the other neurotransmitters and balances them all. So cannabis is a thing that leads to the balance of all your bodily systems. And so the way cannabis works to establish homeostasis or balance of all your body systems is something that needs to be more thoroughly understood. And I'm fortunate to work with some doctors and scientists who are working on that.
Wow. So do you think, and this might be a stupid question, do you think cannabis is a drug?
Oh, yeah. Cannabis is a drug. It's also an herb. But, and there are certain molecules in it that cause, when I first started, most people, there's just two components. Now we know there's like 140 different cannabinoids, and all the terpenes, all the flavonoids, hydrocarbon flavonoids that cause the flavors. And they also have medicinal effects. So, yeah, it's a drug, but so is chocolate. Chocolate is similar to cannabis in its effect on the brain. So it all depends on how you use it.
Wow. How did you juggle all these years? And Teresa, you can chime in on this too. Being parents, and
I was afraid they were going to take our kids away. So we did not smoke marijuana from the time they were babies. We didn't smoke cannabis in their their presence, you know. And so we didn't lie about it, you know. We told them, you know, I could get thrown in jail for this, you know. I think Teresa's going to pop in here. Go ahead, Teresa.
Hi.
Hi, Teresa.
I just wanted to say that because of the drug laws, Paul actually talked me into having 3 natural home births. So I had them all at home.
Wow.
Wow.
All our kids
Yep.
were born at home because they drug test babies, and if they're tested positive for marijuana, then Child Protective Services came in and interrupted your parenthood.
Whoa.
Whoa. Okay.
Yeah, that still has gone on recently,
You know,
even with marijuana legalization.
the ripple effect of all these decisions is so mind-blowing to me, because I look at how much your family and like my friendship with your kids, and you know, you taking us to these events, and not just your own events, but things where I could be a kid, you know. Because I've been through a lot, and like the single mom life, you know, it's a little different. You don't get to go to as many events like Great Wolf Lodge, or you know, going to the movies or eating in different places. And so as we're having this conversation, I'm reflecting on my life, and like even with me getting into high school, and when I smoked weed, I was like, everything they told me was a lie, you know. And I went through so much trouble over being a pothead in other people's eyes, but really I was exploring my consciousness and not wanting to be told what to do. So this has been a really mind-blowing reflective experience for me, just sitting and talking.
Well, I'm glad we could do it.
Of course. Zach, do you have anything else before we close out? I don't want to keep you too long, Paul. I thank you for your time too.
You're welcome.
No, we pretty much went through everything that I would have to ask, so I'm good.
All right. Well, thanks for
Yeah.
having me on. I hope your viewers have hung around to hear this whole thing, and look forward to seeing you, Kemper, somewhere out here.
Of course. I'll pop in.
Okay, you know where we're at, 2712 Northeast Sandy Boulevard, right
All
here in
right.
Portland. So, and for
And
anybody who's interested in finding a doctor or has any other questions, they can call us at 503-235-4606.
they better call or else they're mistaken, all right? So I love you. Thank you. Everybody have a happy
Welcome.
420.
Happy 420.
Yeah.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Paul.